Russian President Vladimir Putin is no longer the strong and stable figure of authority he once was. Increasingly isolated, paranoid, and entirely detached from reality, the 73-year-old leader can feel the tide turning against him. His war in Ukraine has been an abject failure, his country's economy is crumbling, and his former allies have turned their backs on him. The Russian people too, including those who once looked up to him, voted for him and supported him, are growing increasingly angry and upset with their leader's reckless, nonsensical decisions, with protests and pockets of rebellion rising up across the nation. Feeling his power slip slowly away, Putin is desperate to shift the blame for his country's chaotic condition wherever he can, purging numerous generals, elites and officials in recent months. Now, he's even beginning to turn on his closest and most loyal allies, conveying the message that no one is safe and sending the Kremlin spiraling into chaos in the process. Putin has always been known as a ruthless leader, a man who would do almost anything for power, no matter the cost. But he's also built a reputation as someone who values loyalty above all else, rewarding and honoring those that stay true to him, and only taking out his wrathful fury on those that he feels have betrayed, insulted, or disobeyed him. Back when he was first elected president in 2000, he reportedly organized a meeting with 21 of the richest men in Russia, the oligarchs as they were nicknamed by the public. In the 1990s, while the country around them descended into chaos, these men seized any opportunities they could find, indulging in corruption, shady business deals, and even worse crimes to amass their fortunes and ascend to the upper echelons of society. In effect, they controlled much of the country's economy and also held great sway over its political system and wider society too. But once Putin stepped foot in the Kremlin, he assembled them all in order to officially let them know who was really in charge. According to reports, Putin allegedly offered the oligarchs a deal that would in many ways define the rest of his political progression and the future of the Russian Federation from that point on. He would allow the oligarchs to keep their fancy mansions, private jets, and enormous enterprises so long as they stayed out of his way and accepted his authority. Perhaps sensing that they were in the presence of a man who was not playing around, many of the oligarchs agreed to the deal, and they were rewarded for their loyalty. Their fortunes multiplied, their positions of power were solidified, and they were allowed to live out lives of luxury and opulence. Those that reneged on the agreement, however, felt the full force of the president's wrath. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for example, once deemed the richest man in Russia, was arrested by Russian authorities in 2003 and sentenced to 9 years in a Siberian prison for fraud and tax evasion charges. Many outside observers, however, felt that the arrest of Khodorkovsky was politically motivated, since he had been providing funding for opposition parties. Vladimir Guzinski was another to suffer at Putin's hands. Once a cab driver, he soon proved himself a shrewd businessman as new opportunities emerged after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, eventually starting his own newspaper and the first private TV station in Russia, NTV. NTV ran a famous satirical puppet show with scenes that were critical of the Kremlin, and while Putin's predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, tolerated the show, Putin could not abide by it. In 2000, armed agents raided the NTV offices and Guzinski was arrested on charges of stealing $10 million. He eventually fled overseas to Spain. Other oligarchs who defied Putin were forced into exile. Some have even died in suspicious circumstances. Each time something happened to one of them, it helped to cement Putin's status as a leader who evidently valued loyalty, but abhorred disobedience and dissent, and would not shy away from punishing those that got on his bad side. In his autobiography, the Russian leader has even proclaimed, "I have a lot of friends, but only a few people are really close to me. They've never gone away, they've never betrayed me, and I haven't betrayed them either. In my view, that's what counts most." And so it has been for a long time. Putin may have purged numerous officials and elites who upset him in one way or another, but he's always stood by the select few who have proven their loyalty and commitment to the Kremlin's cause. Now, that's all starting to change, as there have been no fewer than 4 high-profile examples in recent times of loyalist Russian figures being shunned or punished by the Kremlin. Sergei Markov was one of them, a political scientist and journalist Markov has held numerous high-profile positions at some of Russia's most prestigious educational institutions, like Moscow State University. He was also, for a time, one of Putin's closest advisors and staunchest supporters, repeatedly labeling the Russian president as one of history's great men. For years, Markov said and did all the right things to endear himself to the Russian leader and enjoyed plenty of power in return for his loyalty. He was a member of the Public Chamber of Russia for several years and was elected to the State Duma in 2007. He also served as one of Putin's most trusted spokesmen during the 2012 elections and has often appeared in Western media as a pro-Kremlin pundit parroting Putin's propaganda. When the war with Ukraine began, Markov once more toed the line, saying exactly what he was supposed to say, following along with Putin's own narrative and using his platform to influence opinions among the public and garner support for the invasion. He claimed, for example, that the war was not against Ukraine but to liberate Ukraine. Like Putin, Markov also spoke of neo-Nazi elements and terrorists taking over Ukraine, arguing that Russia's so-called special military operation was a sort of humanitarian intervention. He also called out America's role in the conflict, claiming to Sky News back in 2022 that the war was not between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the United States puppet who now occupy Ukraine. It's liberation of Ukraine and it's a proxy war of the United States against Russia. We believe there's no independent Ukrainian government and this government is wholly under the control of the United States security community. Markov has been a loyal servant to Putin for years. However, on August 22 of this year, he was officially classified as a foreign agent by the Russian Justice Ministry. This label is typically reserved for those people that Moscow feels are colluding with other countries or engaging in political machinations against the Kremlin. Countless journalists, activists, celebrities, and even ordinary Russian citizens who simply disagree with the current regime or show support for other countries have been deemed foreign agents and effectively treated like criminals. But this is one of the few occasions in which such a high-profile political analyst who has spent his entire career being pro-Putin and pro-Kremlin has been slapped with the same label. It allegedly occurred because Markov is believed to maintain close connections with the political elites of Azerbaijan. In recent times, relations between Moscow and Baku have reached an all-time low, but Markov reportedly continued to visit and engage with Azerbaijani officials, even bowing and groveling at the feet of the country's president, Ilham Aliyev, according to Alexander Kotz, a self-proclaimed war correspondent. Naturally, this didn't please Putin. He demands absolute loyalty and doesn't take kindly to those who show any sort of allegiance or kinship with other countries' leaders, especially those that have angered or defied him. Thus, Markov was punished and will almost certainly struggle to ever recover his former status. Having committed so much to the Kremlin, the analyst was, understandably, astonished to be labelled a foreign agent, initially claiming that it must be some sort of mistake or defamation, before going on to suggest that enemies of Russia were responsible, completely refusing to believe that his close ally, Vladimir Putin, would ever do anything like this against him. "I'm not a foreign agent, and everyone knows it perfectly well. For 25 years, I have supported and continue to support Vladimir Putin's policies. I'm also under Canadian sanctions. This attack against me is being carried out by enemies of Russia and by enemies of Vladimir Putin's policies. Sooner or later, these people will reveal themselves as traitors or will be removed from office as corrupt officials." Several months have passed since then, but Putin hasn't come to his rescue. Markov is still labelled a foreign agent, and while he continues to commentate on the war with Ukraine and other matters of international politics, he no longer enjoys the influence and importance he once had. Roman Alyoshin is another pro-Putin Russian nationalist who would never have been exposed to fall onto the foreign agent list. Hailing from the Kursk region of Russia, which borders Ukraine, Alyoshin once worked as a policeman before moving into business and then finding his calling in the media. He bought up several Kursk outlets and developed a strong online following with more than 150,000 followers on Telegram. After the invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, he began to post regularly about the conflict, while also raising funds for those on the front lines. In November 2022, he was appointed head of the regional volunteer organization named We Are Together, and by summer 2024, he'd clearly caught the Kremlin's eye and was honored with an advisory role for Kursk regional governor Alexei Smirnov. Then, things started to go wrong. First, Smirnov was arrested for allegedly embezzling 1 billion rubles that was supposed to be used to construct defensive fortifications along the border with Ukraine. Alyoshin soon resigned from his role. Not long after, he was accused of using donations that were supposed to support the war effort to buy himself a luxury car. Then in March 2025, Alyoshin announced he had signed up to fight with the Akhmat Special Forces Battalion, taking part in an operation to recapture parts of the Kursk region from Ukrainian armed forces after they had crossed over the border and taken control of several Russian towns and settlements in 2024. He made lofty claims about his heroics on the battlefield, but soon announced that he was terminating his military contract. After that, Alyoshin came under increasing scrutiny, with a video going viral on Russian social media in which he's seen openly discussing money laundering scams. Russia's Interior Ministry subsequently launched an official investigation into the matter, and in September of this year, Alyoshin was officially classified as a foreign agent, just like Markov. And like Markov, he reacted with shock and incredulity to the news, taking to Telegram to share his view. In a lengthy post, Alyoshin argued that he's never received funding from any foreign nations and that the very prospect of him being labeled a foreign agent was absurd. He added that he'd been sanctioned by the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, had only ever strived to provide support to Russian troops on the front lines, and would never betray his motherland or the Russian people. But none of that was enough to get his name taken off the foreign agent list. Now, both men are legally obliged to state that they are foreign agents every single time they post online. They also face crippling financial restrictions and are likely to be shunned by other groups and personalities who don't wish to be tarred with the same brush. Even if Alyoshin was indeed guilty of corruption, that wouldn't have necessarily mattered all that much in the past. Putin and the rest of his Kremlin cohorts have famously turned a blind eye to acts of corruption and other crimes, so long as the perpetrators demonstrate sufficient levels of loyalty. There was a time when someone like Alyoshin would have been rewarded for his actions, honored with increasingly important positions of power, and allowed to live a luxurious and comfortable life while playing the role the Kremlin wanted him to play. Instead, he, like numerous others, has been cut off and cast aside. An even worse punishment befell Tatiana Montian, a Ukrainian-born lawyer, journalist, and pro-Russian blogger. Born in Kerch, on the Crimean Peninsula, Montian studied law at Moscow State University before moving to Kyiv, where she played an increasingly active role in high-profile political cases as the years went by. She opposed the Euromaidan protests in 2013, for example, and defended controversial figures such as pro-Russian blogger Ruslan Kotsaba and neo-Nazi militant Vita Zavaruka. Before the war began, Montian reportedly left Ukraine for Russia, going on to become a familiar face on Russian TV networks and in online videos, sharing her support for the invasion of her homeland and the killing of her compatriots. But it didn't matter how much pro-Putin propaganda she spouted or how many appearances she made on the Kremlin-owned RT network, because on October 27, Montian was deemed not merely a foreign agent, but a terrorist and extremist in the eyes of the Russian government. This is one of the most severe labels the Kremlin can apply, often reserved for those it views as its most dangerous enemies. The Kremlin hasn't explained exactly what Montian did to deserve such an extreme classification, though she has faced scrutiny over misappropriation of money she raised for frontline forces. Montian also spoke about what she called war crimes and total disorder at the front, which may have been sufficient to irritate Kremlin officials just enough to take action against her. Either way, just like Alyoshin, this sort of incident simply wouldn't have occurred a few years ago. When the war began, for example, Putin and Kremlin officials were no doubt thrilled to see someone like Montian on their side, a Ukrainian-born pro-war propagandist they could use to prove that their invasion was just and necessary. Normally, she should have been able to expect a life of comfort and security in Moscow, rising up the ranks of power, perhaps even being awarded with her own TV show or hosting position on a prominent news network, all while enjoying the backing and support of the president himself. Instead, she's now the subject of a major criminal case. Her bank accounts have been frozen, and she's under full state surveillance, with a very unclear future lying ahead of her. The fourth Putin loyalist to have recently seen his status take a sudden and drastic downturn is the most famous and influential of them all, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov has been a major player in the war so far, and is a man who has dedicated his whole life to serving his homeland. He entered politics in the 1980s, becoming deputy director and then director of the Foreign Ministry's Department of International Organizations, before moving into increasingly higher positions of power, eventually becoming Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations, and then in 2004, its foreign affairs minister. Lavrov still holds his position. He hasn't been placed on any foreign agent lists, labeled a terrorist or anything quite that dramatic just yet, but rumors and reports suggest that his influence inside the Kremlin is drastically deteriorating. He was notably absent from a November 5 meeting of Russia's Security Council, for example. In addition, Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, announced that Lavrov had been replaced as the head of Russia's delegation for an upcoming G20 summit. Peskov specifically stated that Putin himself had made this decision, clearly suggesting some sort of rift between the president and one of the longest-serving members of his government. Reporters believe that Lavrov's declining status is linked to recent failed talks between the foreign minister and US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. On October 20, the two men spoke over the phone, with Rubio attempting to lay the groundwork for a meeting between Putin and US President Donald Trump. While the call allegedly went well, the US soon cancelled a planned face-to-face meeting of Lavrov and Rubio, then called off the Putin-Trump meeting altogether. It seems that Kremlin officials blame Lavrov for this dramatic breakdown in Russia-US relations. And the man whose position once seemed utterly unshakable now faces the very real risk of political isolation or even dismissal from the post he's held since 2004. On their own, these isolated cases may not mean all that much. But together, and combined with other smaller incidents of pro-Putin bloggers, generals, elites and officials all being purged from their positions or even arrested in recent weeks and months, it's clear that something has changed inside the Kremlin. Putin is no longer respecting and honoring those who have shown him loyalty over the years. He's punishing even his closest allies the very second they step out of line. Russian political scientist Ekaterina Shulman believes that this is simply the next logical step in the Kremlin's repressive evolution, stating, "First, they went after the anti-war voices, now there are none left, and the repressive machine cannot be stopped." She also expects more arrests, punishments, and foreign agents to emerge in the coming weeks and months, adding, "The Russian repressive apparatus has to fill its quotas. The machine must keep feeding itself." In other words, Putin has started something that even he cannot stop. No longer content with merely locking up and eliminating his political enemies, he's now going after those that are, for all intents and purposes, his allies. The longer this continues, the more chaotic it will become, as even government ministers, loyalist oligarchs and long-term propagandists begin to look over their shoulders, wondering if their name is next on the president's seemingly never-ending hit list. And it may prove fatal for Putin in the long term, as the list of those that remain loyal to him shrinks ever smaller, leaving him utterly absent of allies at a time he needs them the most. Now, learn more about how some of Putin's closest allies have begun to turn away from him in this video, which looks at how the Kremlin's puppet regimes are slowly severing ties with Moscow. Or check out this video to see how one Russian official recently predicted a possible outbreak of civil war on Russian soil in the not too distant future. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay informed and up to date on all the latest military news from Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere across the globe.